During the colonial era, marriage was frequently viewed as a business transaction, and matches were frequently formed on the basis of the prospective husband's social standing, income, and fortune. If love ever happened, the arrangers believed it would come after everything else. In the mid to late 1700s, more than 1 in 3 females was pregnant when she walked down the aisle, despite the fact that modern Americans perceive sexual morality in the colonial era to be, well, puritanical. It is therefore not surprising if the birth or baptism record that you find on Ancestry belongs to a progenitor that was married less than 9 months after the parent's marriage license. It's possible that a peculiar custom from the northern colonies contributed to this premarital fertility. Young single couples tested their compatibility by spending the night together in bed as part of a practice known as bed courting or bundling. In this episode, we discuss the weird practices and strange traditions that were normal in colonial America. In the 1700s, the legal age for women to get married was 12 years old and 14 for men. Marriage was socially significant at the time, and though arranged marriages were decreasing compared to previous centuries, they weren't out of the question. Women of wealthier families were expected to marry well. Even those coming from a poorer background who had more freedom of choice in a partner had to gain the approval of their parents before marrying. Chastity was reportedly guaranteed by placing a bundling board, a long upright plank, between the couple, or by having them sleep in different compartments of a huge bundling sack. This practice was more prevalent among lower classes and along the frontier, possibly as a result of the lack of fuel for warmth and light. Nobody was shocked when hormones overruled these precautions, as Washington Irving noted later in 1809. To this wise tradition, therefore, do I chiefly attribute the unparalleled growth of the Yankee tribe. When you were married, you and your partner had obligations to the community and to each other. Although there was little likelihood that these ideas would prevail over people's emotions and innate desires, formal courtship engagement and marriage did occur, and parents of children old enough to marry undoubtedly desired their offspring to follow this path. Hormonal fluctuations frequently caused people to overlook the road, and the nearby big American seaside cities with a thriving sex business contributed to the high incidence of venereal disease and everyday bustle. Sex was the subject of many myths, and individuals in colonial America upheld erroneous moral beliefs. People frequently had incorrect ideas about it. While most women in colonial America were considered mature enough to begin courting at the age of 15 or 16, most married in their 20s. Almost all towns required young males to obtain permission from the parents of the girls before they could make a sexual approach. Initially, the girls' parents set guidelines for who was allowed to call on their children. Possibilities and property were the important factors. It was common for young men who had neither, at least not in their father's eyes, to be eager to take advantage of a female they had most likely known their entire lives. Although they occasionally prevailed, the daughter was typically coerced into marrying against her will. Whether the meeting was arranged or not, it was customary in many regions for the young couple to go through specific stages of courtship, to see if they could coexist. Because of the long, chilly winter nights and wood-burning fireplaces that kept homes warm, people who lived together slept together. Throughout the colonies, the communal bed served as a place to relax as well as a place to work. A test drive for marriage was arranged when the courting appeared to have reached a point where it was essential. The young man would go to his girlfriend's house and spend the night there, sleeping in her bed while her parents slept in another room. He took this action to test the two of them's compatibility at night. The majority of the regulations were off limits, and a board placed on the side of the bed separated the two children to ensure they stayed out of trouble. A few of kids who couldn't get over the board would have been in grave danger, because the board was usually less than a foot wide. In such case, one needs to question how many boarding nights led to the conclusion of courtships and the moving forward of wedding dates. It was socially unacceptable to be living with multiple boyfriends, and this occurred just before an engagement was made public. If today's complicated dating world disturbs you, imagine being a young woman in love in 17th century Wales. You can't wait to begin your life with your partner. But first, you need to prove to your parents that you're ready to marry by being bundled up in a sack and put to bed. Bundling may have been introduced to the American colonies by the DCK. It was a popular practice in the lowlands and was particularly successful in Pennsylvania and New York. Bundling was a sort of boarding practice during the colonial era, only instead of severing a romantic couple, it drew them closer together, while ostensibly prohibiting them from having intercourse. This unusual courtship ritual had a standard format. Step 1. Invite your date home to meet your parents. Step 2. Watch in horror as your mother ties you up from feet to waist in a heavy sack. Step 3. Get into your parents' bed fully clothed next to your date, under the watchful eyes of your parents, who place a thick wooden board between you and tuck you in for the night. In the heyday of bundling, ideas surrounding marriage and bedrooms were far removed from the privacy we currently hold dear. Bedrooms were semi-public spaces until roughly the late 18th century, and were used for anything from giving birth to entertaining guests. Bundling, which usually involved adolescents, just added one more ritual to the bedroom's list of uses. Bundling bag, a readily available makeshift chastity device, was normally tied around the lower half of the girl's body, though some accounts claim that each young person was placed into a bundling bag up to their necks, if possible. Bundling was so widespread that it was occasionally done in groups to allow strangers to share a bed without fear of being rudely awakened in the middle of the night. Because of this, innkeepers was able to raise their prices for half a bed and increase revenue without having to construct additional rooms. Some individuals believe that the narrative of Ruth and Boaz in the Bible is where wrapping originated. While the narrative in the book of Ruth states that Ruth slept at Boaz's feet on the floor of a threshing room while wearing his blanket, it does not state that Ruth and Boaz were bound together, as is true of many colonial practices. It appears that the theological explanation was added after the fact to clarify the practice's justification to New England Puritans. The distance between the residences and the difficulty of traveling between them have also contributed to the practice's growth. Winter travel in New England or New York at night can be hazardous because the seasons change quickly. When members of the community learned about the practice, many conservative pastors discouraged it in their sermons. Was anticipated, which made headlines in smaller communities. Since the pair was made into a sack together and might engage in some sexual activity, Jonathan Edwards and many other Puritan clergy opposed the practice. The young woman in the bundle's mother or elder sister would sew a line between them so they couldn't come into complete contact during the time it occurred in her home, and her parents were informed and participated in it. The couple would be released in the morning after spending the entire night locked up together. Because of it, the couple most likely told each other a lot of personal information, which undoubtedly infuriated their parents. In larger coastal cities like Boston and Portsmouth, strong, healthy marriages were considered the cornerstone of communal life. Therefore, bundling and boarding were both viewed as beneficial to the community. Even though they were less common, there were situations in which being married off through an arranged marriage allowed a closeness to form between the promised couple that would not have been conceivable in colonial culture, where chaperones were customarily present at public gatherings. The common consensus is that women in colonial America married far earlier than women do today. Although it's untrue, some people did get married quite young. Arranged marriages remained prevalent. When they were still in their mid-teens, some women received marriage guarantees. However, the wedding was typically postponed until later in life. Women were frequently promised property as a component of marriage during negotiations. This was particularly true when the colony's tight class system based on wealth developed. Young men and women in the upper class were supposed to marry someone who had wealth, a good reputation, and real estate. It was difficult for men to get married as a result of this. The eldest son usually inherited the property. Generally speaking, they received smaller estates or less money to start their own businesses. But the oldest also had issues with this system. He had to wait for his father to distribute his wealth before he could sit down and conduct negotiations with his prospective in-laws. People are inherently curious, therefore the system frequently made it difficult for the couple to determine whether they were getting married because they loved each other or because it was an arrangement. In a parent-arranged marriage, one or both parties frequently developed extramarital affairs. It was highly probable that someone would engage in inappropriate sexual behavior. In Virginia, George William Fairfax and Sally Carey were joined in marriage by their parents. Sally was George Washington's first real love, and evidence suggests that she felt the same way about him. Despite the fact that Sally's father believed George Washington was less significant than the Carey family, due to the fact that his older half-brother Lawrence was the owner of the Washington family's fortune and properties, she remained faithful to her husband. In Virginia, Landowning families frequently dealt with these kinds of delicate matters while arranging weddings. This most likely contributed to the high dueling rate that was observed at the time. Not just the man needed to provide anything worthwhile to the marriage counseling, the bride's family was required to provide a present. When upper-class girls picked a suitor on their own, they had to exercise extreme caution. Before planned marriages prevented their ladies from being abducted by the shady son of an English lord who was hiding in America from debtors and wanted to marry into money, this was especially true if the man was from another area and not well known like an English visitor. Common law marriage is no longer recognized by most jurisdictions, but it was frequent in England and the English colonies in North America. They were primarily lower-class weddings, but they were also unions performed without the assistance of a judge or priest. After a couple marries, the husband inherits the wife's possessions and is free to do with them as he pleases. Common law couples typically avoided discussing property throughout their marriage. There is still a misconception that cohabitation for a predetermined period of time equals common law marriage. Not always is this the case, and not always was it in the colonies. Common law, which originated in England, required a declaration of purpose to be made before a person could get married. They did not require written papers, which was one of the reasons they were so well liked in England. A license could be obtained in many towns without having to pay the government a tax or the church a charge. The most accurate way to keep track of local residents was through parish registries. Legal marriages and the children born into them were documented. Even when upper-class people married legally to avoid an unwanted marriage arranged by their parents or guardians, who might have been despised by their peers towards the middle class, didn't feel too ashamed of this. Gentle couples would frequently do it. In southern states like Virginia, where love triumphed over money and social conventions, a process known as an espousal contract was executed by the couple to legally wed under common law. The ceremony was called handfasting. Marriage wasn't as formal an affair back then as you might think. You didn't need a license or even a presiding authority. It was acceptable to have a common law marriage, where you basically held hands and agreed to be married. They held hands and said vows that were very similar to modern ones that they picked for themselves. If there was no witness, they could still say their vows as long as both of them swore under oath that they had done it this way. If someone later questioned them, like the angry father of the bride, they would have proof that they had done it. The majority of colonial church and state authorities recognized an oral marriage contract as legitimate in need for a common law marriage to function, but the Roman Catholic Church did not. In addition, there was a verbal future marriage contract that stipulated that if the signatory couple had a child before to the ceremony, they would immediately become married under its conditions. Agreements were okay, but a lot of working-class women had a sister or friend who would listen when they made the commitments, ensuring that they would be kept even if the male attempted to evade his responsibilities. There were guidelines on sexual conduct in the early colonies in the Scarlet Letter. A few of these laws, which were not always fully implemented, addressed the marriage bed. Most of these regulations probably applied correctly when married couples performed the actions. A man was executed on death row in Plymouth Colony for the crime of bestiality, according to the Book of Leviticus in the King James translation of the Bible. During his execution, he confessed that the animals had been slaughtered in front of him. The court cited a passage from Leviticus to determine his sentence. If a man lies with a beast, he will surely be put to death, and you shall slaughter the animal. Even sexual offenses that were deemed less serious were handled by the courts according to biblical guidelines. Because the founders of the first New England colony wrote about their goals in their first legislation, known as the Mayflower Compact, the Bible played a significant role in the development of sex laws in New England. Though Leviticus states that those who commit incest, adultery, sodomy, or nearly any other sexual act that isn't permitted by marriage between a husband and wife should be put to death, they both agreed that they had come to the New World for God's glory and the advancement of the Christian faith. Generally, kindness prevailed, and lower penalties were handed down as a warning to the community. The purpose of punishment was to make the target of the punishment feel inferior. Both in court and from the church, people were frequently lashed or placed in the stocks for a spell, while a sign from the church described what they had done wrong. Penalties were recorded in court documents. One married woman and an Indian guy named Tinson engaged in what was referred to as the act of uncleanness. She was to be dragged through the town on an ox cart by a rope and beaten. Every time she went out in public, she also had to wear a badge on her shirt that listed the offense she had done. They would mark the emblem on her cheek if they saw her out in public without the tag. The judge determined that Tinson's punishment shouldn't be too severe because he had been coerced into doing his crime. Every time she stepped out in public, he had made a commitment. They would mark the emblem on her cheek if they saw her out in public without the tag. The judge determined that Tinson's punishment shouldn't be too severe because he had been coerced into doing his crime. He had a neck halter fastened to him. Prior to marriage, having sex was obviously forbidden and considered premature. The first child's birth was evidence of incontinence prior to marriage, and since God provided the evidence, the appropriate sentence had to be made. Typically, the wife, who was now a mother, was punished by having her husband beaten and placing her in the stock. As New England evolved, the penalties for sexual offenses became less severe, but the laws remained in effect until the state constitutions were drafted during the Revolutionary War. Several of the new regulations also originated from it. Prostitution. Hinterlands had to be self-governing, despite the fact that the border between the colonies was only a few hundred miles from the coast. The primary duties of the colonial authority were to avert Indian assaults and collect taxes and rents. Because everyone knew everyone else in these little communities, prostitution wasn't as common, though it was still genuine and not liked by most. Although York County, Virginia was primarily a rural area, the little city of Williamsburg was located adjacent to it. The grand jury convened twice a year, and accusations of prostitution were prevalent. Night work was typically the offense against which women engaged in prostitution were accused, with public whippings and fines being typical penalties. Naturally, the court did not find it improper to punish a woman who was partially nude in public. Some localities received complaints about taverns operating as disorderly houses, a word that might also refer to a bordello. These locations were penalized for disobeying the law according to the records. America's larger cities ran ports and were situated along the coast. Coastal towns were active hubs for trade, drawing sailors from all over the world and other American towns to stay there. This was due to the fact that, even in Boston, which was still strongly religious, men of various races and nationalities were frequently employed on British ships. Since there were no police, night work was a booming industry in the towns. The rules have to be upheld by the moral authority of the vice squad. Churches solicited information from the public about night workers so that the authorities could use it. At the time, it was no secret that there were brothels in all of the larger towns. The largest city in the country was Philadelphia. Helltown was the name of a section of the city. There were a few prostitutes there, and although the practice of marking them with red lights had not yet gained traction, it was easy enough for individuals who had been there previously to locate them. Certain brothels in Philadelphia were exclusive to the upper class. They served as discreet spaces for playing cards, enjoying fine wine, and ensuring that the ladies employed there were free of STDs. Foot traffic meandered around the streets close to the warehouses, where people could transact business fast in a dimly lit lane or corner. Before plunging her client into the water, they would frequently be joined in secret by additional individuals who would rob him of any remaining cash. Sexual diseases, particularly syphilis, sometimes known as the big pox, were carried across the colonies by vagrants and homeless people. Abortion was not a topic of great debate in the colonies prior to the American Revolution or even the 1800s, when it did not exist in America. Many are astonished to learn that this isn't because there were no laws prohibiting termination back then. In the colonies, termination was relatively safe compared to what doctors knew and practiced at the time, and it was permitted up until the moment the mother felt her unborn child kick for the first time, a process known as quickening. The evidence that abortion was both lawful and accessible in colonial America is readily available to anyone who wishes to learn the truth, despite the lies spread by some about the history of the procedure. By the late 1700s, the penalties for having intimacy before or after marriage had become so insignificant that they were eliminated altogether. Premature birth rates, which peaked at 40% during the colonial era, indicate that people were having intercourse before they were pregnant. The Puritans agreed with English law and practice as early as Plymouth Colony's Pilgrimage Day, accepting abortion as lawful up to the moment of quickening, which they considered to be the beginning of life during the colonial era. Midwives, who were more common than doctors and generally more skilled at giving birth, assisted with the birth of the majority of babies. These midwives also knew how to obtain a termination, which was typically accomplished with herbal remedies. Surgical terminations were extremely uncommon and risky back then. Because post-operative infections occurred so frequently, all procedures were considered dangerous. Additionally, ladies who chose to have an abortion of their pregnancy were not ashamed in colonial America. Strong, robust families were prized in early American communities, but it was also understood that families that were unable to care for themselves could be a burden on society. Terminations were performed openly and without hesitation in certain areas. The midwife was not viewed as an alien, but rather as a respected member of the community. Other methods of birth control were available, but none was particularly effective, given that the colonies had some of the highest rates of births in the West. Termination wasn't an issue in colonial America. Most of the time, it was done to avoid having children, rather than because it was medically essential, because the state of medicine wasn't developed enough to know the majority of the risks associated with some pregnancies in any of the former abortion regulations, did not become statutory until the early 1800s, following the War of 1812. There was a lot of pornographic plays, music, and literature in the American colonies. The term pornography had a different meaning in those days. The fact that the word was not frequently referenced in laws prevented some scholars from identifying its presence. Words like lascivious, immoral, lusty, yearning, and other terms that were used to characterize it were discussed using language similar to this in the colonies. These words are now considered pornographic. It was liked by Benjamin Franklin, who included it into his works and cartoons while frequently concealing it in sketches or what are now called graphics. From their pulpits, the clergy denounced it, claiming that those who watched porn were to violate even more significant commandments, such as the prohibition on masturbating, which was viewed as evil and unlawful. When a young man named Samuel Terry from Springfield, Massachusetts was seen chafing his yard to arouse lust, he was fined and handed lashes. He did this since he had heard inappropriate comments and was thinking erotic thoughts. Writing professionals who wish to pique readers' interest have also misrepresented Native American traditions and practices. They discussed, for instance, spouses who shared a home with several wives and engaged in intimate activity with one another. Men in the tribe also exchanged wives for one another. It was frequently claimed that the journals of French preachers who coexisted with Indians were the source of these tales. Even though the activity was demonstrated in extremely graphic detail, they were utilized to further dehumanize the Indians by labeling them as savages who engaged in wild, animal-like intimate behavior. During the early stages of the anti-slavery movement, there was also graphic writing in the form of letters and pamphlets that discussed the breeding sheds on southern plantations, where women were raped by men picked by the owner to bear children. These were designed with northern guys in mind. They carried messages opposing slavery as well as intimate content. Slavery was not the same as homosexuality, but slavery was already a source of debate and unrest in the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War. It is evident that homosexuality was widespread in the colonial cities' early settlements, as laws against it were created, and those who disobeyed them faced legal repercussions. Plymouth Colony enacted rules in 1636 that forbade house homosexuals from meeting together and imposed severe penalties on them. Connecticut enacted such laws with even more severe punishments in 1650. Both nations' records make it abundantly evident that although people were punished for disobeying the law, those penalties eventually became less severe. This could indicate that other groups, including the Puritans, have grown more tolerant over time. It may also reflect the times when the colonies were understaffed as they expanded and required healthy laborers more than they did the punishment of transgressors. It might also indicate that judges were reluctant to impose severe penalties for crimes that had grown commonplace, such as having intimacy before marriage and other offenses that caused a backlog of cases in the courts. It was seen as a heinous conduct in the settlement of Rhode Island, which was formerly known as Providence. With the exception of the New Haven colony, which became a part of Connecticut, males collaborate to do wrong because they have given up the natural use of women and are enamored with one another. There were no colonial regulations or readings of the Book of Leviticus that addressed women. That text served as the basis for the laws and penalties. Every colony had laws against sodomy by the time the colonial era came to an end. Even though the rules stated that sodomy was punishable by death, most courts and colonies had significantly reduced the penalty, with some holding that both men and women were guilty. However, opinions evolved over time. A notoriously gay man was in France during the American Revolution, attempting to get employment with the American Army. He was being tried for sodomy concurrently under one of Germany's severe statutes. While in Paris at the time, Benjamin Franklin was aware of the accusations and their likelihood of being accurate. Franklin was also aware of von Steuben's exceptional combat abilities and the value he would bring to Washington's relatively inexperienced American army. Franklin addressed letters endorsing von Steuben to Congress and Washington while being aware of his homosexuality. Being ill was dangerous in colonial America. Epidemics of smallpox, typhus, sera, malaria, scarlet fever, and other illnesses were common in all of the colonies. And there was syphilis, which was on the verge of an epidemic. Although there is disagreement about whether Columbus introduced syphilis to Europe for the first time, he did bring the disease back to the ancient world. It was undoubtedly widespread among American Indians, and colonists soon began to experience it as well. It was referred to as the pox, or the Great Pox. The colonies were viewed by the English home country as a cheaper option to locking up criminals, which would have been expensive for the public coffers. No health requirements prevented convicted prostitutes from being booked into cells, resulting in financial losses for the state. Convicted prostitutes could still be transported to the colonies to serve as indentured slaves, because there were no health regulations in place. Likewise, dealing with them could expose their clients to venereal infections. Consequently, the colonies continued to import syphilitic individuals. People in the colonies were terrified of syphilis as they grew older, since it could harm and disfigure people. Even as early as the late 1760s, right before the events that would trigger a war with independence and England. Like wildfire, syphilis and other venereal illnesses needed multiple intimate partners to proliferate. The fact that venereal illnesses were common in the English-speaking regions of North America is ample evidence of sexuality. By 1760, doctors were growing more and more concerned about its growth, but they lacked the knowledge and resources to stop it because they didn't know what was causing it. Newspapers and broadsheets in almost every Massachusetts city and the colonies carried advertisements by the 1770s. These advertisements, which ran from Rhode Island to New Hampshire and all the way down to Georgia, provided the addresses of medical professionals who claimed to have studied and understood how to treat the sexually transmitted illnesses that were on the rise. In addition, apothecaries encouraged the sale of medications that purported to treat illnesses, but in reality, these just served to mask symptoms, and doctors were unable to treat infections without antibiotics. By the time the US entered the Second World War, venereal infections that originated in the colonies had spread throughout North and South America. In the US, syphilis ranked as the fourth most prevalent cause of death. STDs are still highly prevalent across the nation today. Another explanation for why colonists' sexual practices were similar to modern ones is because venereal illness was one of them. Regarding personal cleanliness, medical professionals were divided. Some thought it was crucial to keep bodily oils and the like in order to be healthy. Others thought that maintaining cleanliness was crucial to warding off sickness and disease. Colonial American bathing customs and notions of cleanliness were greatly impacted by religious doctrine, which served to exacerbate these sentiments. Puritans made socially significant linkages between sin and uncleanliness and the devil. Morality and cleanliness were closely related, with those who bathed having lower rates of sin, transgression, and poverty. Every part of the body was being cleansed by the water, as filthiness of person engendering filthiness of mind. Spiritual health was influenced by clean bodies, clean clothes, clean homes, and clean settlements. Still, Puritans found it difficult to accept that bathing might have a bad moral impact. In particular, it was believed that public baths contributed to immorality and sickness. While opinions regarding bathing during the American colonial era varied, several of the nation's founding fathers were unambiguous about their views on women's hygiene. For example, Thomas Jefferson once said to his daughter Martha, "Nothing is so disgusting to our sex as a want of cleanliness and delicacy in yours." Doctors in the late 18th century advised women to bathe, in large part to cure illnesses that affected female reproductive organs. While Thomas Ewell, a doctor from Virginia, acknowledged the prevailing wisdom that women were so constituted as to become offensive to the nose, for the purpose of suppressing too ardent devotion of males, cleanliness was of the higher order. Women may use smell as a means of defense to ensure protection, by rendering themselves as disgusting as possible, but the stench was offensive to all women. That's it for today. If you're obsessed with history, like, subscribe, and give us a comment on the next topic you would like us to talk about.